Well, good morning, everyone here in the room, and those of you who are joining us online, whether you're at a town or on the road, on vacation, or at work, wherever you are, we're so glad that you joined us. Well, it is the long weekend. I hope that you feel like that sense of relief. If you do, in fact, have a long weekend, or if you're working, I hope that you do get a time to rest. Well, my name is Brittany. I'm the youth and young adults pastor here, and we are just about to ramp up, as Pastor John said, going into summer. And summer is like one of the best times because we have the most fun youth events planned. We have a summer youth team that helps us to plan those. And so if you are in middle school or high school, we can't wait to see you this summer. Well, if you have any memory back in March of 2011, you might remember this catastrophic event that took place off the coast of Japan. It was one of the craziest earthquakes that the world had ever seen that took place just off into the ocean that triggered a 40-foot high tsunami that crashed inland and completely devastated communities. Like, this was one of the most catastrophic natural disasters that our modern world has seen. But maybe what came next you don't remember quite as clearly because it wasn't quite as loud. It wasn't quite as big. It wasn't quite as visible. It didn't knock any buildings down or carry cars away, but it too was incredibly catastrophic and destructive. Just 150 miles from Tokyo, there was this nuclear plant, Fukushima, and it lost power during the tsunami. They thought that it would be fine because it had a great seawall, but the seawall was nothing compared to the waves that came in. And the waves, they came in and they completely destroyed all of the generators and the backup power, leaving all of these nuclear reactors without power. And without power, it took away their cooling systems, which meant they began to overheat. And soon enough, radiation began to leak from them. And of course, people began to freak out. The government officials freaked out. They knew how bad and how dangerous this radiation could be for the community. And so instantly, they sent out a warning. They sent out a warning, evacuate now, get out of here, the air is not safe, you need to leave. And a lot of people, they listened to this warning. They packed up, they got out of there, they got to a place that was safer, but some people refused to heed to the warning. Some people, maybe it was because they didn't have any option of where to go, so they thought, well, I may as well just stay here because there's no other option. Some people refused to listen to the warning because they were so comfortable where they were. They didn't feel the need to get up and to leave their homes, and they had farms to tend to, and they had pets to take care of, and they were just comfortable, so they didn't want to listen to the warning. And some people, and this is maybe the most tragic, some people refused to listen to the warning because they didn't believe it. See, there was no big waves, there was no huge noises or complete devastation that they could see. But there was a different kind of silent threat, a silent killer that they had no idea was going to impact them the way that they did. And what they found from days, weeks, and years later was that the people who refused to evacuate, they began to fall ill, and they couldn't see a reason why. People lost generation of farmland and lost their livelihoods. Children developed complications with their health and developed cancer. And the elderly and the already weak, they died quite quickly. All because they heard a warning, yet they did not believe it to be true and did not act on it. Now, of course, this story is so much more complicated than we are going to make it today, but we have our own silent radioactive killers within our own lives and our own warnings of these radioactive killers that often we refuse to listen to. It's that killer that you don't necessarily see with your eyes, you don't necessarily feel until it's too late, but it is so active and real in each of our lives today. And this silent killer is restlessness. You just took a sigh of relief. Oh, that's not so bad. I'm good. I feel restful. I'm about to go into summer. It's a long weekend. We're good. I can stop listening. But hear me out for a minute. Restlessness is this deep, unsettling feeling inside of you. That feeling that constantly tells you, just do a little more, push a little harder, want more for your life, want to obtain more or to get more, yet at the same time, it is begging you to do less. It's begging you, please work less, please want less, please do less. Dallas Willard, in his book, Life Without Lack, he describes the root to our restlessness. And he says the root to our restlessness is infinite desire. Infinite desire is this part of us that craves something to fulfill us. And he says this in his book. He says, desire is infinite partly because we are made by God, made for God, made to need God, and made to run on God. We can be satisfied only by the one who is infinite, eternal, and able to supply all our needs. We are only at home in God. When we fall away from God, the desire for the infinite remains, but it is displaced upon things that will certainly lead to destruction. It's like our souls are these cups that have just infinite room in them. And we are constantly trying to figure out what is going to fill this cup, what's going to fill this need that I have inside of me, this need for more. But an infinite cup cannot be filled by finite things like we try to make it out to be. It can only be filled by the infinite, and the infinite is God. And we try to solve this on our own. We try to make up solutions of, okay, I have this infinite feeling, this feeling of restlessness within my soul that I need to try to figure out. How do I do that? And the way that we do that, I think, at least maybe this is just like relatable for me, the way I try to do this, but maybe it'll be relatable for you too, is the way that I build my life naturally, the way that I want to build my life, is to start with work. And I start with work, and what does work do for our lives? It's more than just it gives us tools for survival, and it helps us to survive within society. Work leads us to that more that our restlessness is asking for. It's leading us to more money, which then can buy us more things. It leads us to maybe more vacation days or closer to retirement. Work is leading us for more, and what we use with that more typically is we are trying to use it to get more time. We want more time because we think that if we have more time of rest, more time during our retirement years, more time to take care of ourselves and better ourselves, it will lead to well-being. It will lead to this physical, emotional, mental well-being where we feel like a better piece of ourselves. And if we get to that better piece of ourselves, then finally we will get to that place of soul rest. We will get to that place where it feels like our cup is full. Yet what we find is that this pyramid, this way that we build our lives of work, time, will lead to well-being, and then well-being will finally lead to rest, is so unstable. And it crumbles because that foundation of work, that foundation of striving for things, that foundation of trying to get more, does not actually fulfill and doesn't actually work. Yet we have become so familiar, almost comfortable with this way of life. We have been comfortable with those feelings inside of us of restlessness, of wanting more, and we've given it a new name. We've given it the name normal. We said, well, everyone feels this way. The way that I'm running, the speed at which I'm running in my life, that discontent feeling I have in my life, everyone feels that. So it is so normal. And we don't even realize how much danger our souls are actually in. Because when we hear that warning sign go off, saying that this is not the way to build your life, there is a radioactive killer that is in your life, it evokes absolutely no reaction from us. The warning signs are there, but they don't make sense to us because it's just, this is the way we've always lived. This is the way our culture has been built. This is the normal way to build our lives. And there's no big waves, and there's no obvious destruction or smoke going out. It's that radioactive poisoning that I want to urge us to take seriously today. And the chapter of Hebrews today, the book that we've been studying this month, is that warning sign, is that warning that there's a silent killer in our lives that we need to address. So we're in this series called Jesus is Better, and we're looking at the book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews, it's a New Testament book, and it's basically kind of like a sermon transcript that we are reading that the author wrote to be able to teach out some really key truths to people at that time. And one of the themes that we find in this book is Jesus is better. And if you've been with us for the past 3 weeks as we've gone through chapter 1 to 3, you'll kind of notice that we're going throughout history, kind of going through the story of history and all the ways that Jesus is better. So starting with Jesus was better than the angels, that even before creation, Jesus was there and Jesus was better. We found that Jesus is better than Moses. Studying that Moses, he was the savior for the Israelites, taking them out of Egypt, yet Jesus is the ultimate savior as he takes us out of our slavery of sin. And today, we're looking at Jesus is better than the promised land. The promised land being our representation of soul rest. So at the end of chapter 3, it started this conversation about these warnings and about this rest that God is inviting us into. And we carry on this conversation in chapter 4. And it says this, we got a little bit of Bible reading, so stick with me here. It says, God's promise of entering his rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath, they will never enter my place of rest, even though this rest has been ready since he made the world. We know it is ready because of the place in scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, they will never enter my place of rest. So God's rest is there for people to enter, but those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter that rest. But if we disobey God as the people of Israel did, we will fail. Now, I read this chapter earlier this week, and honestly, I just felt confused. I was like, I get that it's trying to say something about rest, but I don't really understand what it's actually trying to say. So I did lots of study this week, and let's unpack it together. But first, we want to look at what kind of rest are we actually talking about here? Are we talking about an eternal rest? Are we talking about a spiritual rest? Are we talking about this peace within us where our souls feel at rest? And the answer is yes. This passage is incredibly multifaceted, that it encompasses all three of these types of rest. That first, there's the promise of eternal rest. That God has promised that this life on earth is not our ultimate home. That all of the feelings of there's grief and toil and pain and feeling so disconnected and feeling like this isn't actually where we belong, those feelings are somewhat real because there's actually a better home for us. And that is this eternal rest that God promises where we get to live in complete relationship with God. But it's also talking about spiritual rest. Spiritual rest is this idea that our hope for this eternal life is secured. That we don't have to do anything more to get it, that we don't have to earn salvation or work for salvation, but that it is a free gift that is offered to us. That all of our sins have been forgiven, our wrongs have been erased, that the brokenness we feel has been healed, and we don't have to do anything for it. This kind of spiritual rest is how I think I feel in my home when there is nothing to do and there's no projects to work on. I love the idea of renovating. I know maybe some of you are the exact same, where you're like constantly thinking of a new project to do. I think I get this from my dad. I love renovating, have none of the skills to actually do it. And I'm terrible at it, but I love coming up with the ideas. And when we finally do actually renovate, last year we renovated our bathroom in our home. And what I found was I get so restless. I get so anxious about it. I get so I cannot think about anything else. I can't do anything else. I am just so laser focused on doing this project and working. And my husband gets so annoyed with me because he's like, can we just take a night off from doing this project? I'm like, no, work harder, because he's the one with the skill. So really, I'm just the slave driver getting him to work harder. But I feel all of the unrest and I feel all of the anxiousness. But when there's no projects to be done, when I can just like sit back and the project is done, the house is clean, everything is complete, you just like take this sigh of relief, like the weight is off of the shoulders, like I can completely rest in my home until the next project comes and then I want to do it all over again. But this idea of spiritual rest is that idea that you are in your own home and there is nothing else to do. There are no projects to work on. There is no renovation to be done because it is already done and you can just rest. And yes, sometimes there's some, interior decorating, some cleaning up that we have to do, but that Jesus has already done the greatest renovation of our hearts and brought us into salvation. Spiritual rest is this idea that we don't have to work for our salvation, but our salvation is already done. So the type of rest we're talking about in Hebrews, it's that eternal rest, that our hope is secured. It is this idea of our spiritual rest, that we don't have to work for salvation. We don't have to work to earn God's approval. And then it's also that idea that we get to actually reflect the rest that we'll one day get to experience in heaven. We get to experience that for today. That there's pieces of this peace that we get to experience in heaven, and we get to experience that on earth, no matter what our circumstances are. It's important to be clear that this kind of peace or this type of soul rest is not the absence of chaos. It's not meaning that there is an easy life or that everything will go your way, that there's no stress because there's nothing to be stressed about. But it's this internal reality that God is with you and that God has given you this deep rest. Think of it as a dream come true rest. This isn't lazy, do nothing with your life, live without purpose, kind of just sit around and let everything happen, be boring kind of rest. Maybe a better word for rest in this case would be freedom. That it's the freedom from constantly craving for something, trying to fill that cup, and you don't even know what to fill it with, so you just keep trying and just keep craving. This kind of rest is that freedom from tedious, life-draining work of this life and having meaningful, purposeful, life-giving work. It's the freedom from working a really hard day and then still going home and feeling like, I am not enough. I did not do enough. I didn't make enough. Me, myself, I am not enough. It's that freedom from feeling like you're on a treadmill that just will never stop and will never slow down. I have this moment that I really love when I go on vacation. And when I get to the airport and I go past security and I go first stop Starbucks. Go to Starbucks, get my chai latte, get my ham and cheese sandwich. And I go and I sit by the gate and I have this moment where I take out my phone and I turn it on airplane mode. Yes, I do that even before I get on the plane. And it stays on airplane mode for my whole trip. So I was gone for 2 weeks a couple weeks ago. Airplane mode the whole time. I am unreachable when I'm on vacation. And this for me is this is soul rest. Just getting to turn it off, knowing that I have nothing to do. I have nothing to work on. No one is going to ask me for anything. It's that deep, I made it. I'm here. Things are okay. And not that life is always going to be like a vacation, but this kind of soul rest, this feeling of dream come true kind of rest is not something that we save for summer vacation or for long weekends, but it's something that we get to experience in our everyday life. But while we know this intellectually, God obviously knows that it doesn't always hit our hearts maybe the way that it should. And that's why he gives Hebrews 4 as a warning sign for us. In Hebrews 4:1, it says, God's promise of entering his rest still stands, so we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. Some translations might read, you must be careful. But I think that this doesn't actually capture the urgency. It's saying you ought to tremble with fear like you would if a radioactive poison was coming your way and about to destroy your future. we ought to be terrified that we might not enter into God's rest. And what is about to come is not meant to be taken lightly or skimmed through. It should shake us to our very core. It should grab a hold of our hearts, and it should make us uncomfortable, and it should make us wonder if we are leaving everything that we know, everything we're comfortable with behind for a new place and a new place to call home. The warning continues in verse 2. It says, "For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they did not share the faith of those who listen to God." So this good news is talking about the Israelites, that the Israelites had heard this good news that they were going to have rest with God in the promised land. The Israelites, we know the story, they were in slavery in Egypt. And for generations, all they knew was how to be slaves. And God was now promising them a new home. He was promising them rest and freedom from their slavery. And we read this promise, it's first actually given to the people in Genesis to Abraham, but God repeats it over and over again, really wanting the people to understand this promise. And we read it again in Exodus 6. It says, "Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I'll bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and the mighty acts of judgment. I'll take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as possession. I am the Lord." Now, the promised land that God was giving them, it wasn't just a promise for, you're going to have land that you can build a home on, or you're going to have a really prosperous land. This was a promise for freedom. It was a promise to build a new home, but it was also a promise of redemption. That what was in the past was going to stay in the past, that they were no longer going to be slaves, that they were going to experience fresh life. It was a promise that God was going to be calling them children. They had only ever known the name slave, and that they were slave to their masters, and now they are going to be called children of the great King. It was a promise of a completely different life. And there's this sole parallel for us today of just as the Israelites experienced slavery and got to have this promised rest of the promised land, our souls experience this restlessness within us, and we have a promise of true rest with Jesus. That like the promised land, life with Jesus is a promise of freedom from slavery. Freedom from those things that you feel so tied to, whether it be sin, whether it be addiction, whether it be seeking approval, whether it be an attitude, whatever those things are that you just feel like you cannot get away from, you cannot feel free from. It's a promise of freedom from that. It's a promise that this world is not the end. That sometimes the reality is this world can suck, but this is not our forever home, that we have a forever home that is void of all the grief and pain that we experience here. It's a promise of redemption, that the past would stay in the past and that we get to experience fresh life. And it's a promise that God would call us his own and would be with us forever. And this is such good news, but there's a warning within this news that we can't be like the Israelites who heard it and didn't believe. Because while the Israelites eventually got to the promised land, sometimes we forget what it actually took and how disobedient they were in the middle of it. The Israelites, they were in transition between slavery and the promised land. So they were out of slavery, not yet in the land that God had promised, and we call this place the wilderness. And they had been wandering the wilderness for 40 days, and they were exhausted. Okay, they were exhausted from wondering, where is food coming from? Is God actually going to provide it like he did the other day? Where is water going to come from? They're heartbroken because their children wouldn't stop crying, begging their parents, can we please just sit down and rest? They were exhausted from constantly having to set camp and then pack up camp and then set it again and not having a place to call home. They felt exhausted from just being so unsettled. And they were desperate for the promised land. As desperate as you could possibly be for a different place, they were desperate for the promised land. And they finally reached this place where they were at the border of the promised land. They were so close that they could almost taste it. And God told Moses, who was leading them, to send 12 men into the promised land to scope it out. And this wasn't to scope out the dangers or to scope out how they were actually going to take over this land, but I think it was to scope out and see how great the land was that God had promised them. And so these 12 men go, and we read the account in Numbers 13. But you might remember what happened next by the song that we sang in Sunday school. The 12 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw giants, big and tall. Some saw grapes in clusters fall. 2 saw God that was in it all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Basically sums up the whole Numbers 13. You don't even have to read it now. But the people, the 10 men, they only saw the dangers of this world, of this land. They were seeing everything not through the promise of God, but through their own perspective and their own ability. And the perspective with their own ability was that these men are too big for us. These fortresses are too vast for us. This civilization is too strong for us. We ourselves can never actually overtake them. And it was only the 2 men that saw the land clearly through the promise of God. That, hey, if God promised us this land, we're getting this land, and how amazing is it? Look how big these grapes are. Look how this land is flowing with milk and honey. We cannot wait to call this land our home. But the 10 men that were bad, they went around telling everyone, this land is too dangerous. We will never get to this land. Be terrified. And the people believed them. They believed that the land was too hard to obtain and that God's promise was not real. And the consequence was significant. The consequence was that whole generation who did not believe in God's promise that he was going to take them into the land, despite how hard it looked, they ended up dying in the desert. They would never actually get to see this promised land. And from what we learn in Hebrews 4 is that their problem was this. They did not believe God's promise for rest. They heard the promise with their own ears, yet it says that they did not share the faith. And this word share with faith, maybe a better translation would be mixed with faith. And it means digested. They took in the words, and then they chewed on it for a minute, and then they spit it out. They did not digest it. They did not take in any of the nutrients for it or the good things that it had for their bodies. Chewed on it, spit it out, and they were done with it. And so we are warned in Hebrews 4, don't do the same. Don't hear God's teaching, God's promise that we get to experience this soul rest, chew on it for a minute while you're sitting in a service, and then go spit it out the minute that you exit the church doors. But actually digest it. I loved this quote, but also it sent a chill through me this week by David Guzik. He says, think of the joy that Israel had coming out of Egypt and approaching the promised land. Then think of all the graves dug in the desert. A wonderful promise was available but unattained. They came short because though they heard God's word, it was not mixed with faith. It wasn't digested. They did not take it in. They did not take the words and take faith and put them together to fully get to step into obedience with God. And here's the warning for us today that we better not refuse to listen to. That we can hear the words of Jesus, offer this invitation of freedom, this soul rest, yet never get to experience it. That we can build life thinking that we are doing it right, we're doing it the normal way, yet we're building a life void of the promise, peace, and hope that God is asking us and inviting us to live in. And if this warning isn't enough, the author of Hebrews gives explanation for why we are being given this warning and why this freedom is so important. And it explains that this pattern of rest was set at the beginning of creation. Hebrews 4, 3-4, it says, for only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath. They will never enter my place of rest. Even though this rest has been ready since he made the world, we know it is ready because of the place in Scripture where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all of his work. And he didn't rest because he has this kind of a body like ours that just gets really tired from creating, from building. You know, he didn't look and he's like, I just cannot create one more animal, or I cannot throw one more star into the sky. That wasn't it. He rested because it was complete. There was not one more thing to add or one more thing to take away or one more thing to change. He looked at creation, he said, it is good. It is done. I rest because it is complete. And this image of resting because something is fully complete, there's nothing else to do, is the exact image of what Jesus did on the cross. That it is fully complete, that when Jesus was on the cross and right before he died, he said, it is finished. He said it because the work of salvation was done. There is not one thing that you can add to it. There is not one thing that you can take away from it, that it is fully done, it is fully complete. Second, as we go on, so we see this pattern of rest at the beginning of creation when God rested, and then it is a reflection of how Jesus finished the work on the cross. It also explains that this rest is meant for today. Verse 7 says, so God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted, today when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. This quote from Psalm 95, it's repeated in Hebrews 3, really trying to drive the point home. That today, if you hear the voice of God, today if you feel that little inkling inside of you where God is pointing out a place of restlessness, that silent killer within your life, do not harden your hearts and ignore it like the people of Israel did. Today is the day to make the change. Yesterday's gone, tomorrow is uncertain, today is the day. This warning that is constantly being repeated as we're learning today comes with an invitation to stop thinking like slaves and to act like children. To stop thinking of like slaves of your schedule, slaves of work, slaves of these mindsets and beliefs, and to start thinking of children of God and know with confidence that soul rest is your right as a child of God. And Hebrews 4:11 tells us how to obtain it. It says, let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall of the same sort of disobedience. This word strive, it makes me think of work. Like it's almost feels like an oxymoron, like it's telling us to work for rest. But what I think it is actually saying is strive and work to dismantle our own beliefs about rest and about the invitation God has extended us, and strive for that kind of rest. Do your best, do everything you can to get and listen to God and obtain that kind of rest. Dismantling those beliefs that rest is just being lazy, or rest is boring, or that rest is, that classic Sabbath stereotype where you're just sitting around doing nothing, or that why would I rest when I feel so motivated to work with purpose? And it's dismantling those beliefs to look at what does rest actually mean? What does rest actually look like? And what rest actually looks like is not a habit. It's not a thing to do or a thing to take away. This kind of rest is a person. It's the person of Jesus. I have a bit of a problem in my marriage. We'll get back to Jesus in a second. The problem is me. I fully admit I am the problem. And the problem is that I really struggle to sleep without my husband. Like, it's really bad. To take you back a little bit, before I was married, I had this idea in my head that I was never going to share a bedroom. And I was like mostly joking, but also kind of serious about this because I loved my own room. I loved how clean it was. My bed was always made. It was just this perfect, restful room. And I've really struggled to sleep through all of my adult years. I don't know where it comes from, but sleep is a stressful and a struggle for me. And in my head, I was like, well, if I add a husband into my room, he's just going to make it worse. That he's just going to, he's going to roll over and keep me up in the night. Or if I marry someone who's like one of those 5 a.m. workup kind of people, then, he's going to wake me up. And I don't want someone to ruin my rest. And so for a long time, I was like, I'll just never get married. And then I was like, no, I want to get married, but I'll just have my own bedroom. We'll have 2 separate rooms. But then I met Scott, my husband. Turns out I love him. And I was like, okay, this actually isn't so bad. I'll share a room with you. And what I have found is I went from so pathetic thinking I never wanted to share a room because someone was going to ruin my restful space that I'd created for myself, to the very opposite end of the spectrum, where I am so pathetically dependent on Scott that I can't sleep if he's not in the room. And it's not just like, oh, he can, be in the living room or something. He just has to be in the house. No, he has to be right there next to me, lights off, ready to go to bed. He has to be fully rested for me to feel at rest. And I have the most loving husband, and so he actually does this for me. And he comes to bed with me every single night, even though he's one of those wants to stay up till 1 a.m. and I'm a let's go to bed at 10 p.m. kind of person. He comes and he will sleep next to me every single night to allow me to actually go to sleep. I am very aware that I am completely pathetic. And I was talking to someone the other day who has been married for 45 plus years, and she said she has the exact same problem. So I'm like, sorry, Scott, we're screwed. This is just our life now. I thought I was going to grow out of this. Turns out I'm not. This is how it is. But before I knew Scott, I thought I knew what rest looked like. And then after I got married to Scott, I saw what I could actually feel, that I could actually fall asleep easier just being in his presence. And some of us need to become pathetically dependent on Jesus. That when we experience the rest that Jesus has to offer, everything else that we used to consider rest no longer feels restful, and we really can only rest when we are in the presence of Jesus. Are you pathetically dependent on Jesus? And is this striving to enter that rest really pursuing after the person of Jesus? And what happens when we do this is that we find everything else in our life begins to change. That when we start with the foundation of Jesus giving us that soul rest, that we find that we actually have more time because Jesus starts to realign our priorities. He puts everything in its rightful place, from finances to relationships to the way that we work, and we actually find that we have more time because we stop worrying about all these other things in life that don't actually matter or don't actually make sense. So we start with the foundation of soul rest. We go on to have more time, and what we find when we have more time is that we then get to experience that well-being. That our physical health, our emotional health, our mental health, it all kind of aligns because we have this foundation. So we have more well-being, we have more time, and what we find when we start to stack these things in the right order, going from soul rest to well-being to time, is that then our work becomes purposeful. That we aren't working to strive after to fill our cup that is infinite, that will never actually be filled by anything of this world, and that we begin to actually feel full, and our work isn't to strive after more, but it's actually so much more purposeful and meaningful. The work has already been done, but we have to take that step forward. We take that step forward towards Jesus, listening to the warning that he has given us and dismantling those beliefs that become silent killers in our lives. Let me tell you what it looked like for the Israelites to finally do this. We read the story in Joshua 3, and we finally get to that day where the Israelites are ready to cross over into the promised land. And the Israelites, they come to the border that is the Jordan River, which is separating the wilderness from the promised land, and they're 40 years late. 40 years after the moment where God said to that one generation who didn't believe, the consequence of you not believing is that you don't get to enter the promised land. Now a new generation has come up, and they did believe, and they were about to enter it. And so God takes them to the edge of the river. And you want to know when God decided to do this? It was during flood season. It was the most inconvenient time for a whole nation of 2 million plus people to cross over a river. The waters were much higher than they normally would. God had 40 years of planning this out. You think that he could have planned it for a day when the waters were at its lowest, when the rains weren't coming down, when everything was calm? Yet God chose to take them into the promised land during flood season, the worst time of the year. But he called the people, and the people, this generation, they believed that God's promise was true, and so they took the first step. And the priests went first. The priests, they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is what held the promises in the presence of God. And they go and they get up to this rushing river, not really knowing what God was going to do, but knowing that God called them to step into it. And as they stepped into the river, it slowly began to part. That these rivers that were rushing and flowing and completely flooded, dry ground was created. And I think we underestimate what this actually was. This river was huge. 2 million people had to cross it. And God divided the river so that they could cross it on dry ground. And once all the people crossed over and had entered the promised land, God gives them one last instructions. And the instruction was to go back into the river and to grab 12 stones from it, and to bring those 12 stones onto land to create an Ebenezer. And an Ebenezer, it's a monument of remembrance. And it says this in Joshua 4. It says, "In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." These stones that God asked them to take out of the Jordan and stacked upon the land, they were meant to be this memorial site. They were meant to be this site to look at, that any time that people saw it or asked about it, that they could then talk about how God took them out of slavery and out of the wilderness into rest. It was to be a testimony of what God had done for them. And we are called to place a marker in our lives, to remember our own passing into rest, to remember our own, not just our passing from slavery into the rest that God has for us for eternity, but also the passing of, I am dedicating my life to live with this kind of soul rest today. And I believe that this marker that God invites us to set up in our lives is the Sabbath. Now, I know a lot of people hate the Sabbath. People hate talking about it. People don't want to be told to take it. So let me just tell you my own conviction that I have found and that God has really tried to press into me. It is that I am meant to make a Sabbath as an Ebenezer for my own life, as a monument for my own life, to remind my heart that it doesn't have to work for salvation. It is meant to remind my heart that there is nothing else to do to gain the approval of God, but that God already approves of me and loves me and has called me his child. I feel convicted for my own life that when I take a Sabbath, that it is meant to be a day that I pretend that there is nothing else to do. And there are things to do. Okay, there's a full-time job to work on. There's Collide Conference to work on. There's my side projects to work on. There's the things, the people to mentor. There's always one more thing to do. But I'm committed to taking a day every week where I pretend that there is nothing to do, to remind my soul that there is nothing to do for my relationship with God. To take a day that is true freedom and to truly delight in God. And this isn't a boring day. This isn't a sit around and be lazy and do nothing day. This is a soul-fueling day that I get to spend with God and with the people that I love in my life to remind myself that I have entered into the promised land. Maybe that's not your conviction. Maybe that you have a conviction to explore Sabbath in another way. But I really want to encourage you because I do feel so strongly about this. When it comes to Sabbath, will you set aside your own assumptions of it, your own excuses of why not to do it? And will you actually explore what that might look like for your life in the stage that you are in right now? Just consider it. I've personally just found it so life-changing. I just want other people to experience that life-changing as well. Maybe today's warning is that you have not accepted Jesus' invitation for the hope of spending eternity with him. And today, if you hear his voice, would you explore it? Look into it. Look into that person that is calling out to you, that person that something is going on in your heart. Would you look into who that person is? Maybe today's warning is that you've accepted what Jesus has done, but you live like you still have to earn it. You live as if he still doesn't accept you or he still doesn't love you, and you are trying to add more to your life or do more things or take things away. You're trying to do so much to get his acceptance. Would you remember that it's already yours? That the work is finished. Jesus said, it is done. It is finished. And you get to live that out. And maybe today's warning is that you are exhausted. That you've built a life that feels unstable and feels like it is about to crash down. And honestly, if you feel like your life is unstable, that maybe you've built it upside down, that maybe this unsteadiness is God's warning to you, telling you that that kind of life is not what he meant for you. That he actually has a life that despite circumstances, despite the really hard and grievous things that are happening in your life, that there is this inner peace that we get to experience, that we get to say, it is well with my soul, because I am simply resting in the presence of Jesus. We've each been given a warning today of that radioactive poison in our lives. So the last thing I'll say is this. Today, if you hear his voice, please do not harden your hearts. Let's respond in worship together.